All right, hi everyone. So I'm Max Barkley. I'm a software engineer at Red Hat, and I'm the lead developer of the Errai framework. And my talk today is going to be about how you can use the newest version of Errai, Errai 4, to build more native web applications with Git. So for those of you who haven't heard of Errai before, so it's a web framework built with Git. And we have a couple different kinds of features in the framework. We have some popular client-side features like dependency injection, client-side templating, two-way data binding. But we also have some features that specifically help you integrate with Java EE servers. So we support things like special client-side support for invoking JAX-RS interfaces and sending CDI events over the wire. So on a higher level, Errai is a declarative web framework, so we heavily use annotation-driven features, and with the goal of trying to make your code sort of express its intent more and sort of remove common boilerplate from web apps. Errai, as a framework, we try and sort of enhance the compile time safety of your web apps whenever possible, by failing fast at compile time and providing early developer feedback. And we think that's really important for a Git framework because we know that a lot of people choose Git and Java because of the compile time safety that you get from that environment. So my talk today is going to be broken up into three parts. I'm going to start off by introducing you to sort of the basics of developing with Errai. I'm going to focus sort of on three of our features, the dependency injection, templating, and data binding. So after that, I'm going to do a brief review of JS INTEROP. It'll be pretty quick since I think we've spent a lot of time on that yesterday. And the sort of majority of the talk is going to be the last section about special JS INTEROP support in Errai. So we're going to talk about using DOM elements directly to build UIs with Errai, how you can make your own element wrappers that integrate well with Errai, and wrappers for web components. And then we're going to talk about sort of how you can use dependency injection in Errai to work with third-party JavaScript libraries. So the first feature I'll talk about, dependency injection. So dependency injection in Errai is completely declarative, and it's based on the CDI specification for those of you who are familiar with Java EE. So there are two main concepts in dependency injection in Errai. There are beans and there are injection points. So a bean is an object that's managed for you by the container. And beans will have some dependencies, and they'll also potentially have lifecycle methods that the container will invoke for you. So there are a couple different ways you can declare a bean in Errai. One that I haven't shown here is that actually you can inject any class in Errai that has a public no-argument constructor. So actually any type can be a bean, even if it isn't specifically made for Errai. But often you will add a scope annotation to a class, like the singleton service here in the top left. And there are many different scopes, but ones like application scope can define a bean as being a singleton. You can also declare a bean by annotating a method with produces. So this will cause the container to invoke this method for you when it needs an instance of that type, this foo type. So the other concept, injection points, are how you declare dependencies for your beans. So when you have a bean that's just a class with a scope, you can declare dependencies using the inject annotation by putting that on a field or on a constructor to declare all the arguments as dependencies. This is pretty standard stuff. So the way dependencies are resolved in Errai is based on type and qualifiers, where qualifiers are just annotations you can use to sort of get extra granularity or control. So this is an example of a typical kind of use of qualifiers in Errai where, so a common scenario, so you might have an interface that has multiple implementations in your app. And in this situation, if you were to inject that interface without a qualifier, like in the bottom left, that would be ambiguous and this would fail at compile time. So the sort of best way to resolve this is to use a qualifier in the injection point, like on the bottom right, that uniquely identifies the bean that you would like to inject. And this is a nice approach because then we can still inject the type only referring to the interface, so it's still possible to mock out that object in a normal unit test. So you can declare sort of startup logic using the entry point scope. So entry point annotation is a scope like the application scope from my first slide that is a singleton type. But unlike the application scope, entry points are created immediately when your application starts. So the post construct method here is a lifecycle method that the container will invoke a post construct method as soon as a bean has been created. So you can use this combination of a post construct on an entry point to add startup logic for your app. So that's the sort of the very basics of dependency injection. So now I'll talk a little bit about client-side templating in Errai. So yeah, client-side templating in Errai basically allows you to define UI components in two parts, where the template is consists of pure HTML5 with no special markup. And your behavior goes into what we call a templated bean. So the template file, like I said, is pure HTML5. So at minimum, that's going to be a single HTML file. And then optionally, you can include a style sheet, which can be CSS, or it can be a less style sheet that Errai will compile to CSS for you. So here are a couple examples of template files that you can use in Errai. I hope that is readable, but the main point of this slide is that a template file in Errai can be either a simple fragment, which is really useful when you're just starting to develop an application, or it can be a full HTML page, which allows you to more easily work with an external design team and sort of consume assets from them. So once you have your template files, you can declare a templated bean by adding this templated annotation onto a class. So there are a couple things going on in this top example. So the templated annotation has attributes that you can use to specify where your template files are. So these, in this case, these are interpreted as relative paths. So at compile time, Errai will look for a home screen HTML file that should be in the same package as your home screen class. Now this, if you name your template files after your class, like in this example, that's sort of the normal convention in Errai. And so in this case, if you name your files like that, you can actually omit this configuration and use this declaration at the bottom, which would be the same in this case. And the is element here is an interface that's sort of like the interface that Harold showed in his talk yesterday, that is sort of analogous to is widget, and it gives you a programmatic way of adding this UI component to the DOM if that's what you want to do. So once you've declared a templated bean, you can use what we call fragment identifiers to replace elements in your template with UI components in your, that are fields in your templated class. And so a fragment identifier is just an ID or a class or a data field attribute on an element in your template that uniquely identifies it. So in this snippet here, every element has a different kind of fragment identifier that can be used to isolate or refer to it. Okay. So so you can, in your templated bean, you use the data field annotation to map your Java fields to elements in your template. So, for example, in this user form class we have on the screen, the text box username, because the name of the Java field corresponds to a fragment ID in our template, this text box will replace the input element with the username data field. And you can also, like below for the password text box, specify the fragment ID as part of the annotation, which is useful if your fragment identifier has hyphens or other characters that you can't put in a Java field name. And as well, you can see in the templated annotation, there's this hash user form, which is also a use of a fragment ID. And this is how in Errai, if you're using if you happen to be using a template file that is a full HTML page, you can use this to specify what the root element of the UI component is. So this allows you to reuse a large template file multiple times, sort of isolating different parts. So you can also declaratively define event handlers in Errai templates. So it uses an event handler annotation, and this is capable of declaring two kinds of event handlers. You can have event handlers for GWT widgets, and you can have event handlers for native DOM events. So first example here is an event handler for a native browser event. So what's going on here? You can see we have a data field for a button with the submit fragment ID. So there would be in your template somewhere a button element with the fragment ID submit. And below we have a method that we've declared. So it has the event handler annotation, which specifies the element that this is a handler for. And the type of event it listens for is declared by the argument of this method. So the parameter type you might not recognize. This mouse event is a JS interop type in Errai that it wraps the DOM's mouse event. And because in the DOM API, events like interfaces like mouse event correspond to more than one kind of browser event. So for example, a mouse event is used for a click, but it's also used for a double click. So we use this for event annotation to declare that this handler is specifically just for a click event. And this is also compile time safe in that if you change this for event to some event type that isn't valid for a mouse event, so like a value change event, say, then that would cause a compilation error. So declaring an event handler for a GWT widget is very similar. You still use the event handler annotation, and the two main differences, the argument type in this case is a GWT widget event. And because Errai will need to register this event handler with a widget, it's necessary in this case that you inject this button data field for the event to be registered on. Which is not necessary for the DOM events. So just going back for a second, for this, for a mouse click event, it's not necessary to have this button data field here because you can register events directly against elements in your template. All right, and the last feature in this section that I'll talk about is the two-way data binding in Errai. So I think we talked a little bit about data binding yesterday, but sort of in general, right, this is a feature that allows you to declaratively synchronize the state between some kind of data model and some collection of UI elements. And this is a really, I think, really powerful feature that helps remove a lot of common boilerplate from web applications where you would otherwise just be writing code to update state. Importantly, this data binding in Errai is two-way, meaning that when a user enters a change into a UI field, that propagates to your model. But also the opposite is true, where you can programmatically update your model to have changes appear in the UI, which is also really nice because you can, using this feature, you can program everything for your UI directly against a model, not have to worry about dealing with the elements. So the first step to data binding in Errai is that you need to declare a class as bindable. So the bindable annotation simply tells the framework that this class is a type that can be used as a data model. So there are some restrictions that apply to type when you annotate it with bindable. So first, it has to be a class. You can't have interfaces be bindable at the moment. So bindable type will have properties, like in this case it have a name a property called name that is a string, and a property called address, which is an address type. And another restriction on bindable types that's enforced at compile time is that every property of your model needs to also be bindable. So normal types, or rather standard types like primitives and strings, and even some other common types like Java util date are all by default bindable. But then if you have a field like address, then you would need to make sure that that type is annotated bindable as well. Otherwise, that would fail at compile time. So once you have a bindable model, it's easy to, you can start using that with data binding right away. So there are a couple different ways that you can get an instance of that model that is active with data binding. And sort of one of the simpler ones is you can simply inject it using this model qualifier. So when you use the model qualifier, Errai will satisfy that dependency with an instance of your model that is proxied for data binding. And then you can, in that same type, you can declare UI components as bound to properties of the model with the bound annotation. So in this case, so below you can see we have a text box here that is called name. And once again, because the name of the Java field matches the name of a property in our model, this will be synchronized with the value in this text box will be synchronized with the value of our name property in our model. You can also, like below, do what we call nested binding. So because every property of a bindable type has to also be bindable, you can bind directly to properties of a property. So assuming our address had street and number properties, this is how you would bind directly to those, like in this street and number fields. And sort of importantly, all of this data binding is type safe. So our name property was a string, and so we've bound it to a text box. If we were to try and bind that to an integer box, that would be a compile error. And similarly, we would assume that the street would have to also be a string, and this address.number would have to be an integer. Otherwise, these would also cause compile errors. All right, so that's the basics of Errai for now. Just before I continue on to the next section, does anyone have any questions specifically about the features I just showed you? Yeah?
One about the bindable annotation. You tell that every field inside the class needs to be a primitive type or a string, or if you have a another subclass can be in that situation. The subclass like address can be marked to take out don't bind that part.
So you're asking if it's possible to have a property in your model that isn't bindable? So currently, no. But it's a little more complicated than that. So one thing I guess I will clarify here on this slide. So you'll notice one of the bullet points says that the property names are actually inferred by the getters and setters. So for your bindable model, it doesn't actually, the fields, the Java fields are actually not what matters. It's what the types are on your getters and setters. So on the one hand, that's not possible. On the other hand, you could have a field that is some non-bindable type, provided there are either no getters and setters for it, or there are getters and setters for some other type that is bindable that you then convert. Yeah, so I hope, does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, it's kind of the same question I asked down in this stage. Is it possible to apply this annotation without annotations for existing model?
Okay, so the question is, can you have a type be bindable without having the annotation explicitly on it? The answer is yes. So every Errai project has a properties file that allows you to specify some extra configurations. And for a lot of the annotations in Errai, it is possible to specify a list of types as a property in that file. So yes, it is possible to make types bindable without altering the source. Yes?
Do you have support for GSS?
We do not specifically have support for GSS right now. And that's not off the table, but sort of at the moment we're trying to sort of mostly stick with sort of non-GWT specific HTML5 templates, so sort of as the idea being that we want to make it as easy as possible, and, or rather focus on sort of accepting templates from an external design team. So, yeah.
Okay, one more.
Yeah?
If you have a CSS file which is linked to the template, do you authenticate that the names of the CSS? I mean, you can have a clash of names between classes of different templates in your app?
Yes, so we do not transform the CSS at all. Yeah, so in that situation, if that's something you're worried about, would be possible to sort of include the GSS separately and just not use the style sheet feature. But yeah, that is something that you can run into, and it's not something that we specifically protect you from.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yes?
Is it also possible to bind a generic object like a map key value,
So sort of, it's actually a feature that we recently added. It's not, it's still experimental, so it's not really part of our public API right now. And we're still deciding if this is a feature we actually want to support, because sort of in general, it's preferable to sort of have specific types, that aren't just sort of arbitrary maps of things that you can use for binding. But it is possible right now, but you would sort of have to poke around the code to find it. Okay. So so I'll briefly go over some JS interop concepts we learned yesterday, just to make sure everyone recalls. Recall from yesterday that there are sort of two particular use cases of JS interop, right? You can use JS interop to consume external JavaScript, and you can also use JS interop to sort of publish a JavaScript API. And in this talk, we're really mostly concerned about the consuming use case. So you'll recall that the JS type annotation is sort of one of the core parts of that API. And by default, if you just add JS type with no other configurations, that is exporting an API. So what we're really more concerned with in our case is native JS types, right? And yeah, so I don't think anything here is new, right? You use native JS types to sort of wrap JavaScript APIs that you would like to consume in your app, and they sort of get compiled, invocations get compiled with the same symbols, right? So we'll be using JS property in the next section. So just it's important to recall that you can use JS property on methods, right, to transform the invocations on those methods to property access or property assignment. And yeah, and the last thing just to recall is that you can use the JS overlay method to add implementations on a native JS type with some caveats. But this is you'll see that this is a useful feature for working with Errai in a bit. All right, so JS interop support in Errai. There are two general use cases that we're going to go over. So the first is working with DOM elements and web components. So we're going to talk about injecting them, using them in templates, and using them with data binding. And then the second use case is just in general, how do you inject a JavaScript object into an Errai app? So I think we all know after a lot of the content yesterday that the new best practice in building GWT apps is to try and avoid using GWT widgets and to work more directly with the DOM. Errai 4 provides a collection of some JS interop element wrappers and also wrappers for the DOM's event API that help you do this. And this isn't a complete collection per se, so it's not like Elemental where we've just generated things from the DOM API. But it's designed in a way you'll see that is very easily extended so that it can sort of, you can add elements as you need them to fit your use case. And actually, so I will take a break from the slides for a second. Just quickly, I have to get my mouse over there. All right, I did it. So this is a declaration of our HTML element. Sorry, I'm just going to look here. Yeah, there we go. So this is our HTML element, JS interop wrapper, which is sort of the core, the root of our element hierarchy. And you can see that this is just a native JS type, and it's not so important what these methods are, but just to see that we've chosen to wrap all of the elements as interfaces rather than classes, and use the JS property to create getters and setters, so that on the one hand, this has the advantage of making use of the DOM API look more natural to Java, since instead of accessing properties, you're using getters and setters. And it also has the advantage that since all of these wrappers are interfaces, it makes it easy to mock them out in non-GWT test cases. So I just wanted to point that out before I continue. All right, so back to the slides. There we go. So the DOM element wrappers in Errai can be injected into your types just like you can with GWT widgets. So for most of the wrappers, there's a one-to-one correspondence between the interface that you would inject and the tag name of the element you're getting. In some cases, though, that's not true. So the heading element, for example, there are multiple types of headings. There's H1, H2, and so on. And so in these cases, you can use the named qualifier to resolve ambiguity and specify specifically which kind of element you would like to inject. And also you can see at the bottom that it's also possible to inject sort of an HTML element using the named qualifier. And this feature, or in this case, you can actually use the named qualifier to inject an HTML element with any arbitrary tag name. And what Errai will generate for you is just, it will satisfy this by calling document create element and just creating an element with that tag name. So this is useful if you just need to use an element in a template and there isn't specifically a wrapper for it, or maybe you don't care about having that specific interface, you just need it to you just need to inject an element like that as a data field. Oh, my slides are out of sync. There we go. Yes, all right. So you can use all of these wrappers as data fields, yeah, so this works right away, and just exactly like the widget examples from the earlier slides. And this actually has a big advantage over the sort of old Errai 3 approach of using widgets as data fields, in that you're, at runtime, your UI components, when you use this approach, the markup tends to look exactly like the markup in your template, which in the past has not always been the case, since when you inject a text box, you're getting sort of not just a single element, but an entire little mini fragment. So this makes it a lot easier to use styles on elements from a design team, since your markup that you're using at runtime ends up being exactly the same. Of course, using elements also works with data binding. Now, thought you might have is that, what are the values, though, that you're binding to in an element? When it comes to widget types, like say text box and integer box, it's very clear that these all have values of specific types. For elements, Errai provides a sort of collection of sensible defaults. So for the most part, most elements are considered to contain string values. So if, for example, if you bind to a heading element, like in this example, Errai will bind a string value to the text content of that element, so literally the value between the tags. Okay. Errai provides some different defaults for input elements and text areas. So in particular, there are input elements of various types, like checkbox and text and password. And Errai provides defaults, understands the types of values in those elements, and it will cause errors if you attempt to bind the wrong type to an input element. And it will also, instead of binding to the text content of an input element, it binds to the value property, which is sort of the correct behavior you want, since that, for those elements, that is where the text that a user types is stored. So I mentioned earlier that the DOM wrappers, that DOM wrapper support in Errai is easily extensible. So to illustrate that, here is sort of a snippet of the div element definition in Errai. You can see that this is, it extends the HTML element I showed you earlier. It's a native JS type, but notably there's this @element annotation on the interface. So this is how you declare to Errai that this JS interop wrapper is an element, and in particular it's an element with the tag name div. And by adding this annotation, Errai will generate injectors for this type, so that when you inject a div, it will call document create element with that tag name, and just satisfy those dependencies just with the browser element. So another feature that we have that you can take advantage of is that you can sort of use this property annotation that we have to sort of create different configurations of elements. So if, for example, with GWT widgets, we have text box, integer box, we have these different types of inputs. So to kind of emulate that with the DOM API, you can create different types of input elements, wrappers. So in this example, we have two examples here of a text input and a password input. You can see they're both annotated with @element with the input tag name, since they are, in fact, both just input elements. But we've used the property annotation to specify that a text input has the type attributes with the value text, whereas a password input has the type attribute with the value password. So this, in effect, allows you to inject, a specific type when you want, say, password input or a checkbox input. So you still have that sort of bit of type safety there, but this is still just a thin JS interop wrapper, around an element. There's really very minimal code that's generated for this. So I showed you earlier how when you inject a heading that you need to use a qualifier because there are multiple tags. This is how you would declare an element interface that has multiple tag names by passing in an array of the possible tag names. And what's nice about this is, that Errai will generate injectors for each of these tag names, and it forces the user to use a qualifier. So you can create your own interfaces, if you like, that can be used for multiple elements if the situation arises. So now let's talk, we've talked about sort of working with normal DOM elements. Let's talk a little bit now about web components. And the nice thing about working with web components in Errai is, since web components are specifically designed to be like just normal HTML elements, working with them in Errai is almost identical. So you can see, for example, here is sort of a first version of a Polymer paper input wrapper that's actually taken from our Errai tutorial project. And you can see that, just like the element wrappers I showed you earlier, it has this @element annotation declaring that the tag name is paper input. And this works exactly like the element wrappers, in that if you try and inject a paper input, the Errai will call document create element with the paper input tag name, and provided that you've imported the definition of this web component on your host page, this is just going to work at runtime. So right away, you can, with that definition, you could use a paper input. You could, by injecting it, you could use it as a data field in a template. But the one question you might have is, well, what happens when you bind to this paper input? Right? So I explained earlier that the binding to element wrappers, Errai provides sort of sensible defaults, and obviously that doesn't work for web components, since every web component can have its own specific API. And in particular, Errai's default behavior would not work for this element, because Errai would try and bind to the text content, like this middle code example, whereas what we want is to bind to the value attribute, because a paper input works like more like a normal browser input element. So that brings us to, well, how do you declare a different way to do this, to what the value of this element is? So Errai provides a native JS type interface called hasValue that's kind of analogous to the hasValue for GWT widget types. And this is an interface that you can extend on your element wrappers to declare different ways of data binding. So how it works is that when you extend hasValue, like in this modified paper input definition at the bottom, Errai will use the getValue and setValue methods on your wrapper to do binding with that element. So if we combine that, if we override those methods in our element wrapper and use a little bit of extra JS interop, we can actually specify how to bind to this paper input element declaratively. So you can see this is sort of the final version of this paper input wrapper that's taken directly from Errai's tutorial project. And we've overridden the getValue and setValue methods. And we have added JS property to these declarations. And the end result is that Errai will generate code that will call the getValue and setValue methods in Java, like on the left. And that ends up being compiled to JavaScript that accesses the value property, which is exactly what we wanted. So that sort of shows you one way that you can use has value and some JS interop to bind to a web component. But we'll go over a couple different tricks you could do for different kinds of APIs. So suppose you're working with a web component there where you do need to bind to methods, but those methods have different names. So you can use the JS method annotation, as I believe Daniel showed yesterday, to rename what those methods are compiled to. So in this case, the Errai would generate code once again that uses get value and set value, but that would be translated to this invoking these methods getter and setter. And the last trick, which is the most sort of general approach you can use, is you can override these get value and set value methods with JS overlay implementations. So this is sort of the last resort you can use to if you have some really complex behavior with data binding. Oops. Oh no, my slides aren't updating. Sorry, 1 second, let me fix that. JS overlay, web components. Okay, sorry. So, so the last example is using JS overlay. You can override these get value and set value. So what this example is here is an email or an anchor element wrapper that specifically is designed to allow you to bind to an email address. And what this does is, so when the Errai sets the value for this, you can see we've added a JS overlay implementation that sets the text content of this element to the email address, but it also creates a mail to link, right? So this is an example of how you can add some more of complex data binding behavior. Right, so now that's sort of the basics of working with web components and DOM elements in Errai 4. I guess before I go to this last section, does anyone have any questions about that? I'm not sure if my slides were showing properly during some of that. So are there any questions? Yeah?
What are you using for content injection? Is Gene Dagger or some internal implementation?
This is an internal implementation that is designed to work like Java EE's CDI specification. So, yeah.
And the configuration, the sarcastic configuration, like alternatives or something, is this?
Yeah, it supports, so it supports a lot of CDI features. Alternatives is one of them, specializations, producer methods, like a lot of CDI things are supported right now.
Yeah, but how to configure it? It's like the XML like in Java EE? Or?
Right. So that's an important difference. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a properties file that's part of every Errai application, and so that is where additionally you can add this configuration of alternatives. Right. Okay. So the last topic is. So just in general, how do you work with third-party JavaScript libraries in Errai? So in general, right, we want to be able to inject JavaScript objects from third-party libraries into our applications. This is really important because, as I'll show you later, it makes it easier to run unit tests of your usage of JavaScript APIs in a normal Java SE runtime. So in most cases, when you're working with a JavaScript library, there's going to be some kind of function or object in the global scope of the page that you're going to want to access somehow. And what we're going to show you is that you can, if you use JS interop to declare a way of accessing some global object, you can easily add a produces to that either method or field to just declare that as a bean that you can inject. So, so as an example, I'm going to use jQuery, right? Since I'm sure most people are at least basically familiar with this, right? So the jQuery has, in particular, that $ jQuery function that you can use to wrap elements. And so this is going to be sort of the object that if you were working with jQuery in Git code that you would need to inject somehow. Right? So the first thing is that you need some kind of JS interop wrapper. Since we don't have a JS interop generator yet, this is a sort of snippet of a handwritten wrapper. And you can see that there's a JS function that represents the jQuery function. And it just has this single wrap method that returns a jQuery element, which is another JS type where we would define all of these methods that are on an enhanced jQuery element. Right, so once you have that API, then the next thing you need is some way of accessing that $ function that's in the global scope. So here are two approaches. So the first one is to declare a static field somewhere using JS property, which I think Daniel showed us something very similar yesterday. And then there's another approach, which I personally prefer, which is very similar, but instead of a property, you declare a static method. And this has the nice side effect of enforcing that the $ is read only from Git code. Right? Yeah, and as we already know that, right, if you use the static field or method from Java, that will end up getting compiled to just a simple invocation of the $, right? So now, how do we inject this type, right? Because we don't want to have to refer to a static field or a method in our code, because that's going to make unit testing more difficult. Okay, well, it's showing there. That's good. So how do we declare this as a bean? There's really only one extra annotation you need. So you can, whether you go with the field or the method approach, in either case, you can just add a produces annotation onto the field or method. And the end result is that you, just with this one annotation, have declared a bean that can now be injected into any of your types. Right? So that might seem simple. Well, why does this matter even, right? So dependency injection, we on the Errai team in general believe it's quite important. But particularly, we think that when you're working with JavaScript, with JavaScript APIs, that it's really nice to be able to just inject those APIs and then mock out the JavaScript and run those in just simple unit tests. This is an approach that we take internally in Errai and with some of our Red Hat teams that use it. And it has the advantage of just being able to shift a lot of your tests from running in Git test cases, which are quite slow, to running just in normal JUnit tests. And in particular, if you use constructor injection like this, then it is not even necessary to use a mocking framework, although it's still, I find, quite pleasant to use something like Mockito. All right, so that is this talk. Just as a summary of what we talked about today. So we talked about some basic features of Errai: dependency injection, templating, data binding. Right? We talked about JS interop support in Errai, how you build UI components in Errai using native DOM wrappers, how you work with web components, and how you can create bean definitions to inject native JavaScript objects. So that's my talk. I've posted here a couple links that you might be interested in. So there's a link to our Errai framework website, and there's also a link to our Errai tutorial project on GitHub, which uses some of the things that you saw here today, like the Polymer paper input elements. And thanks a lot, everyone.